good morning, everyone. Good morning, April.
Morning.
Yeah, how are you? How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm doing good. Yeah, so welcome to UNAWA.
Yep, welcome. And so this is our first online conversational series,
Mhm.
and it comes from the Filipino word, which means to understand. And my name is April, and with my friend Cools, we're here to help normalize the conversation around mental health in the Filipino community. We want to encourage Filipino youth and families to find common ground and understanding with each other while also inspiring our community to find meaningful solutions that will benefit us as a whole.
Yeah, that's right, April. And if you could remember, we had a conversation a year ago on this topic, right, in our Bayanihan workshop. And of course, with other youth leaders, we specifically identified different issues in the Filipino community. And one of them is we identified is the need for us to destigmatize and address mental health issues in our community.
Mhm. Yeah, and this is not just an individual battle, right? But it needs a community effort to understand the issues and find solutions. And like you said, not just in our time, but for the upcoming generations of Filipino families. And so in this series, we have a different topic each month since it is Filipino Heritage Month in Canada. Our topic this month is Filipino spirit during hardship.
Right. So, well, of course, happy Filipino or Philippine Heritage Month all across Canada for all Filipinos out there, and all those who have also Filipino at heart. So um, uh, happy and congratulations to us, guys. And in this first installment of our series, we want to highlight resilient stories and the coping strategies of Filipino individuals and families, especially during this time of pandemic.
Okay, yeah, and so to help us explore this topic, I want to introduce our guest who will give insights and some background on mental health and well-being and how Filipinos are facing these issues, especially the youth.
Yeah, and before maybe introducing our guests, April, maybe we'll ask ourselves and the viewers to reflect on these questions. Uh, why is mental health important to me, and what interests me to be part of these discussions?
Yeah, for sure. That would absolutely guide us in our discussion moving forward. And if you have any specific questions about this topic that we missed during the discussion, please write it down in the comments below.
Yeah. All right. So I guess we're ready to introduce our guests. Okay, they're here. So um, our first guest is one of the youth leaders who participated in our Bayanihan workshop last year. So she's a recent BA or Bachelor of Arts in Criminology graduate from the University of Alberta and a second generation Filipino Canadian. And in 2019, she conducted a small research project interviewing professionals and frontline workers who work with the Filipino community to uncover the invisible challenges of Filipino youth here in Edmonton. Let's welcome Axella Apostle in our virtual roundtable conversation. Hi, Axella.
Welcome.
Hello. Hi, good morning.
Hi. Welcome, Axella. Our second guest is a registered provisional psychologist working with Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op based in Edmonton. Her clients include Filipino families and especially children and families of immigrant backgrounds. Please welcome Joy Midori.
Hi, Joy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me today.
Yeah, that's no problem. It's really our pleasure to have you guys and in our virtual online roundtable. So Joy, let me just start with you, just to give us some context for this series. Could you just give us a little bit of explanation what is mental health and how it is different from mental illness and why it is so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really good question, actually, because we often talk a lot about it, but a lot of people don't really understand or have a harder time implementing certain activities that will facilitate mental health. So mental health really speaks to the determinants, right, of what makes us emotionally, cognitively healthy. So we, especially within our immigrant population, we often talk about risk and protective factors in mental health. So it's assumed that the more risk factors you face, the harder it might be for us to attain well-being. So interestingly enough, as you guys could probably understand, risk factors can also be protective. So when a person's challenges and hardships, even facing trauma in our early lives, if we overcome it, it provides us a sense of competency, sometimes even a sense of purpose, and most importantly, a sense of accomplishment. So this contributes to what we understand as resiliency, right? So there's a model, it's called ADAPT model, and it's a strength and resilience-based approach to understand what makes a person healthy. And it's a really good model to understand also the experiences that immigrants face pre and post-migration. It proposes that the pillars of psychosocial stability comes from a person's sense of safety, bonds and attachment, a sense of justice, knowledge of one's identity and roles, and when we have meaning in our lives. So these all contribute to our overall sense of health. When these are threatened, which is often what happens when we face traumatic events or big unknowns like this pandemic that we're facing, we find ourselves dealing with mental health issues. Sure, like there are biological factors like genetics, temperament, and others that contribute to what we would identify as mental illness. But for the majority of people, it is my opinion that these pillars I mentioned, when they become under threat or when they disappear from a person's resources, they cause distress, and the symptoms indicative of things that we know to be challenges for people, like anxiety, like isolation, and at times deterioration of physical health overall.
Right. That was awesome. You gave a really superb insight of what is really mental health. And so how can we take care of our mental health, and how can we practice self-care, if I could say that?
Yeah, self-care, I think we all can agree it's much easier to do, to said than done, right? And I
Yeah.
think sometimes, as we'll be frank, right? We're people of color, and then so we're really driven by ambition and achievement and success. It's almost like we have this thing in the back of us being like, hey, you got to keep proving yourself. That's what it feels like, right? And everybody can, I think, attest to that. Self-care requires commitment to self and enough compassion to self to allow ourselves to feel like we're worth it to invest in. We invest in so many other things in our lives but ourselves. So there's so many resources out there. Honestly, if you guys go to chapters, there's millions of books on self-care. If you Googled self-care, you could pick and choose from there. But most importantly, what's important about self-care is that it has to fit for you. Everyone has a different interest and time available. So you need to pick activities that fit for your lifestyle, right? So they're the typical ones. There's one that's called Take 10, for instance. So take 10 minutes every day for yourself, whatever that may be. There's exercise, yoga, gentle movement, exertion. I prefer gentle, but some people need kind of that, very high impact kind of exercise to feel good. Nutrition, reading, and not just reading like Axella, you're a recent grad, right? So not just reading academic books, but actually reading things that you like, watching favorite shows, or even listening to podcasts that has nothing to do with your work. Then, so that's the piece that I think, like, the more practical ones. And then there are the more interpersonal self-care that becomes really difficult to implement. So it's like as simple as, we say it all the time to our kids, hey, you make mistakes. But how hard it is for us to forgive ourselves when we make mistakes. So regularly and consistently, we do have to forgive ourselves. So if you feel like you require perfection, find a way to drop that idea, because it will just bring you anxiety and stress and sadness. Perfectionism is not a way of life. So kindness and compassion to self is the most important, but hardest to execute. And just bringing us back to the pillars I mentioned, increase your bonds and attachment with others, right? That's one way for us to have self-care. Family and community. Engage in activities that you find meaningful, that brings a sense of fulfillment, like what you guys are doing here today, right?
Yeah.
If something bugs you and things feel unjust, explore on how you can make positive change, however small. Make sure that it resonates with your being, and it might give you insight as to how you may want to live out your purpose. Explore your core identity. Includes our cultural identities. So give that part of ourselves acknowledgement and pride. Understand the roles that we play in our families. Know how they're meaningful. Community and friends. So we have to also dig deeper in self-care and identify our values and what we believe in, because we have to engage in discussions with others unlike ourselves so we can learn and grow. And all of this takes a while to do and figure out, but remember these pillars, and it will nourish well-being and build resiliency.
Yeah. That was awesome, and you mentioned a while ago about this anxiety and everything. So I think that was a result when we're not taking good care of our mental health, right? And speaking about that, and what really happens when we don't take care of our mental health, and what are the first maybe signs and symptoms that we may tell ourselves or maybe others that we need these resources and we need this one to better take care of ourselves?
Again, that's a really good question. And the first thing I would ask people is to pay attention to your bodies. Our bodies really give us a lot of clues when we're being stressed. And often we like to use our minds and our heads to explain away everything, even emotions, right? So it's so important. We all know when we feel stressed. I'm thinking again, Ace, you have your second child, and Axella, you've just finished exams, right? You can probably think of situations where, there's activation inside the body. So the body has wisdom. We just have to pay attention, right? And, by the time people pay attention, unfortunately, it's too late. But throughout all of this, our body is giving us signals. So sometimes it's a tight belly. Sometimes it's an increased heart rate, right? There's lots of little signs that tell us, hey, slow down. Go to sleep a little bit longer, right? But we have to pay attention, and unfortunately, I think we just take for granted our bodies, and we just assume it's going to be there forever. Hey, and Filipinos have long lives. This is good. We're resilient that way, but that's right. Noodles. Eat a lot of noodles.
That's it. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's really great. And well, a few other questions are, why do you think people are still struggling to take care of the mental health, and what do you think prevents us, and what are the barriers we're facing?
So speaking directly, so I'm a first generation Canadian. So when I was thinking about this question, I'm really coming from the lens of the immigrant and newcomer experience. So there's some big ones, right? Like language barriers, right? System navigation, loss of status, professional and personal. People deal with lots of loss when they come to Canada. So that is really important to appreciate that as immigrants, we do come with a lot of emotional, mental stress, right? And so a lot of this stuff that we feel isn't our fault. But we need to acknowledge that we have these things that we lost, and we need to grieve those. Change of roles in the family system, right? Parental shifts that need to adapt to a Western world view, individualistic versus collectivist kinds of parenting paradigms. And then the big one, right, that we're talking about today is youth today have to navigate two worlds. I mean, we all do it every single day, but we really don't understand how often we have to be so mindful that we're both Filipino and Canadian, and integrating these two worldviews can sometimes be difficult and also create internal conflict. Parents and children are experiencing lots of isolation as newcomers. there's a lack of belonging, a sense of belonging, right? So official systems also misunderstanding our culture and the importance of family, right, in our overall functioning. I also see families who are dealing with like reunification issues, right? So lots of families have been separated for years because, you know, mom or dad are employed elsewhere abroad, and then all of a sudden they're coming here for the first time. It's like a ticking time bomb with kids who are struggling, trying to build their identity as a young person with someone that they might not really know, right? So economic, financial strain, so poverty, domestic violence, right? And the big one that we don't, as Filipinos, are very good at, we're not very good at talking about, is our own previous history of trauma, right? So it includes abuse of different kinds and intergenerational transmission of trauma. So depressions, disorders, abuse. And then the big one, you know, that's a big one today, is the racism and discrimination.
Yeah, that was, that is really awesome when you talk about that, all of those issues. But one of the reasons that's why one of the reasons that we started this series, that because there were also some challenges that have been identified in our Filipino community that you mentioned, and especially with our Filipino youth that are struggling with their mental health. And Axella has a research about that, and maybe you could tell us a bit about your research, and then maybe what are the current challenges that our Filipino youth are facing, specifically with mental health.
Sure. So Joy has already touched on some of these findings that I had. So just to give a bit of background, I conducted a few in-person interviews with, as you previously mentioned, with professionals and frontline workers who work with the Filipino community. And there were some themes that came out of those conversations. So the first one, as Joy mentioned, is the struggle of growing up into cultures. So Canadian culture and Filipino culture are sometimes at odds with each other, where Canadian values of independence, individuality is at odds with Filipino values of togetherness and respect for your elders, that kind of thing. So it can be difficult to find their identity and find belonging in these spaces. So looking for acceptance was a big theme amongst youth. So especially school-age youth who, if they're newcomers, they're coming to this new space and they're trying to form new relationships. So some of them tend to stick with other Filipino peers. The benefit of that is being around people who understand your culture, are able to speak your language, and overall they're just more comfortable with that familiarity. And also it might be because of other peers who have bullied them or have been racist towards them. So they might not be too keen on forming those outside relationships from their ethnic group.
Mm-hmm.
And other Filipino youth, they have formed relationships with non-Filipino peers, but sometimes it's at the expense of language, their attachment to their culture, and sometimes even compromising their pride in their Filipino identity. So an example of that would be youth wanting to be misidentified as another ethnic background, for example. As some youth have been rejected, they've found influence and acceptance from not so great influences, from negative influences, such as peers who have also been rejected and might engage in more rebellious behaviors. So as a result of this, some of the participants mentioned how youth have now become involved in some gang activity, drug use, teen pregnancy, and skipping or dropping out of school entirely. So that really limits their opportunities when they're struggling academically, their opportunities for success in the future and for upward social mobility. And so trying to figure out this identity can be really stressful and can also lead to conflict in the family between youth and their parents. So they might not be getting along with parents who can't relate to their experiences or can't understand what it's like to live between these two worlds. And especially for newcomers, there's a lot of struggles. As Joy mentioned, with parents working abroad, they might be forming relationships for the first time or rekindling relationships that had been formed a long time ago. So as she said, it's like living with a stranger and trying to have your parent understand what it's like. It's not really there because the parents and youth have different understandings of what it's like to be a young person growing up in these different worlds. So youth might feel like they can't go to their parents and talk to them about how they're feeling because their understandings of hardship are different. And so the parent might be like, oh, I don't understand why you're having such a hard time. I had a hard life growing up in the Philippines. I came here to give you a better life. Why is it so hard for you? And so there's that disconnect there. And also with being an immigrant, some are faced with the hardship of making a living for your family. So they might be working long hours. They might not be at home to form those relationships with their children and might not be around to help guide them through their lives, like helping them with homework. So that's also where like the fallout from school can also happen. And there's also the conflict of expectations versus reality when it comes to thinking about life in Canada. So it might be hard for some parents to admit that life in Canada isn't the way that they expected it to be. And they might have told their kids, I'm moving away and I'm doing this for us to have a better life. But there might be disappointment in that when the youth realize that life isn't as great as it is, as their parent made it out to be in Canada, when they come here and they realize like our parents are struggling, we're living in a tight 1-bedroom apartment with our whole family in a not so great neighborhood. So there's also the stigma associated with that, with like wanting to save face and not admit that things aren't as great as they could have been. So yeah, those are some of the themes that came out from the research.
Yeah, so that was really an awakening research and you mentioned that, Axella. And maybe Joy has a firsthand experience with the families, Filipino families. So maybe you could share. I think you've mentioned maybe a bit a while ago, but maybe if you could mention some of the current challenges the Filipino youth and families that you've learned through your practice, Joy.
Yeah, actually, Axella, you've really nicely, kind of rounded out many of the issues. And I love that your research comes like straight from, people's lived experience. But yeah, just echoing exactly what Axella has talked about is there's just a lot of, I think, conflict that arises from the issues. There's also that sense of kids feeling like they just can't talk to anybody, right? Like, so, we are in our culture, the idea of being grateful is like super key, as like a huge value. And, we hear people talking about like, if you're, maybe being a spoiled brat or something, right? The mom or dad will say, oh, wala kang, wala kang utang na loob, they say, right? And it's like, so when we say those things to our children, kids feel really bad, right? Ashamed for even talking about feeling sad, right? Because our parents, of course, went through horrible like challenges and got through it. And, they sometimes can't understand like, hey kid, like I went through that. I got through it. Like, why can't you get through this? Right. And so, but we also know that kids today are facing different challenges than our parents ever had. Even from between me and the generation after me, kids are facing different challenges. Social media is one challenge that I never even grew up with. I have no idea how, I didn't know, I guess, how terrible social media has impacted children, young people's mental health, right? And so I think, like, as Axella talked about, there's so many layers and what's happening in young people's lives that contributes to the deterioration of mental health and well-being. And so I think that it's really, really important for us as parents to put ourselves in these young people's shoes, because it is a different world. And we have, I think, as parents, to realize it and be okay with not knowing everything, right? And I think that because us as parents want to protect our kids, and it's really hard to admit, to our kids, like, what is this social media? How is this impacting you? And of course, social media is also impacting our elders, like the people that we look up to. And so I think it's all of those things that Axella has shared is huge. And I see it day in, day out in my practice.
That's really, really very true when you say in the family right now, there's always a disconnect when you're talking about social media, being in same household, and so the parents are not so not so aware, or not so comfortable using it. But you mentioned that there are some barriers to taking care of our mental health, Joy, and within our Filipino culture, it's so hard for us, as you mentioned, talking about mental health illness, even at home. So how can we address this issue, and how can we begin talking mental health, even in our family?
Yeah, I think we need to drop this idea that we're invincible to mental health. It's dangerous to think this way, because lots of people go unheard, and lots of people go unhelped, right? And continuing to pretend, like as a people, I guess, that we aren't impacted by pain and suffering, and that we can all just get through it, right? We have this Filipino mentality, which is a really good. It's served us well, that we're such resilient people. We really are. But some people just can't just get through it because of all of these barriers I've talked about. It's not people's fault sometimes. You can't just pretend, to not be sad anymore. It's much harder. So this mentality is really going to drive our people, and especially young people, to feel ashamed and guilty about feeling down, depressed, lonely, when they feel helpless, right? And as parents, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is that our youth are struggling. We just have to admit that. The statistics say that our youth are struggling. And that it's not as easy to just forget about it, or just to be happy, grateful for what we have. It's important to keep in mind that just because our youth are struggling, that they're sad, it's important to know that that doesn't mean they're not grateful to be in Canada. These are two separate things, right? And I think for all parents, it's really hard to see our child in pain. And somewhere along the line, we feel often very guilty and ashamed that our kids are not feeling good or not doing well. And we take that as our own failure. And it's not. We actually have to rise above that feeling and realize, like, this is my child's experience. It has nothing to do with me, but I could be there to help my child walk through with this. So often when we feel guilty and ashamed without any intention, we can accidentally make the child feel blamed, right? For what's happening to them. And that doesn't help anybody. So I think I often ask parents, when they are talking with their child about what's happening, and if the child is open, just refrain from asking questions, right? Don't ask why. Don't ask how, don't ask when it started, and instead just reflecting to the child what they are hearing. So if a child says, I feel no one likes me, I feel like I don't belong, it may help a child feel more heard if a parent's responded with, you feel like no one likes you, right? That's a really hard way to feel, right? And instead of who's making you feel bad, I'm gonna go talk to them, right? Like that. And we continue on and refrain from asking, but just reflecting to the child. That's hard. I remember feeling that way when I was a kid. I get it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's in silence, you can say something like, just that sounds like it's really hard for you to talk to me right now. I understand, but I'm here. and I'll sit with you until you're ready. So if we refrain from asking questions and just really trying to listen, really trying to understand where a child or youth is coming from, then we get kind of permission after 15, 20, 30 minutes of listening. Only then we ask the child, and together we come up with things like, what kind of things may help you feel a little bit better today, right now? Not the issue at hand, because you're not going to fix that, right? Mm-hmm. We ask them to help us help them find a solution. We don't tell these kids that what we think they should be doing, especially as soon as they start sharing with us. How often have you guys felt like when you're kind of sharing something hard, right? Mm-hmm. And someone's like, you should really need to do this, right? You just drop it. You don't even want to talk about it because you're just like, you can't handle, really when we do that, we're saying to each other, I can't handle your pain. So I'm just going to tell you to stop talking because I want to solve it for you right now because I actually can't handle the pain you're feeling. So it's about us when we're trying to solve issues without hearing people out. So it's really important in any relationship. So this is not just about kids, right? This is about partners. This is about friends. Refrain from providing solutions too quickly. Even though we're trying to be helpful, it can make people feel invalidated, right? And unheard. So that's really one of the best places to start is to ask people, hey, how are you doing? Not why are you feeling this way, right? And then taking the time. And that's the problem, I think, is often, and in a lot of ways, many Filipino families are working 2, 3, 4 jobs. I get it. I get that it's hard to take the time to listen. But you have interactions every day, daily with your kids. So just take a few, right? And take the time to listen. That will change everything. Because a child might be like, I can see you, mom and dad, working your butts off to provide for us. I see it. But when you have time, you do listen to me. And I appreciate that. That's when a kid can feel like they got somebody that has their back, right? So the other thing is we need to be okay being uncomfortable, knowing that you can't fix everything, right? So listening is actually the greatest gift you can give to someone who is suffering.
About the resilience piece that you were talking about, Joy, it reminded me of this Facebook post I saw a few days ago. And it was talking about Filipino resiliency and how it's a quality that we have associated with for such a long time. But it's saying that, yes, we have been resilient for so long, but it doesn't mean that we should stop there and stop asking for things to be better. So we don't have to sit in our suffering. We have to acknowledge that we do have these struggles and that they are valid. And sometimes they're shared by more people than you think. So when it comes to trying to break down the stigma on a community level, we should be able to acknowledge that there are these patterns that we as immigrants and descendants of immigrants face, and that they are real, and that we should want to have the conversations that will lead to destigmatizing these conversations and finding solutions so that we don't have to continue struggling, because there is something we can do. And it starts with that conversation and being vulnerable and being open. And so that's why we should start with having the hard conversations about these topics in order to start making things better for us as a community.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Axella. I think, April, you have a question a while ago, right?
Yeah. Joy, just through meeting with Filipino families and youth, have you identified any coping strategies for people to use?
Yeah, I think, we often forget our cultural ways of being in this role that has, as you said, Axella, contributed to our resiliency. Filipinos are really funny, right? We are a funny bunch of people. We're really goofy. And I think these are, when you think about family gatherings and just how loud everything is, and there's music everywhere, there's kids running around, that is a coping skill. We have cultural wealth that has helped us get to where we are today. And I think we can't forget that. So singing, dancing, sports, I mean, these are huge things. I know, April, with your group and, you know, doing all that work that you guys do is amazing, right? Because it brings people together, but it also connects us to some of our roots that we can't forget. So there's like, it's not there are lots of ways that we have coped, but we need to also identify what we've used for generations, right? And so those connections, they are important. They're a value. And even if you as a person maybe, you know, grew up without a lot of family around, there's this longing for that. You know, I haven't been to the Philippines since 2005, and I'm like longing to go, and I don't know where it's even coming from, but I know it's there because it's a core piece of who I am, you know, that I want to connect to that. And I think as people of color, we need to take pride in that, and because that's what's going to nourish us. That's a coping skill that can't be, you know, documented. It's very difficult to name, but you guys all know what I'm saying, right? We could feel it. So community is big, sports, music, art. So I've already talked about, you know, spending time together and connection and attachment. And here's a big one. This is a big one people have a hard time with, is lessening time with technology, right? You know, face-to-face connection is really important. Even what we're doing here, you know, there's a very big difference. I think this is a big one for parents too. You know, if everyone, parents, youth, took time to see how much they spend on their phones and devices and gaming, it would be clear that their attachment is to a device and not necessarily a person or their family. Mm-hmm. So technology, I think technology is wonderful. I think it's important that we expose our children to it, but it should be limited and it should be used responsibly. We have addiction to technology that we don't even understand yet because it's so new. And I feel bad for the generation that grew up with it, because they were like kind of guinea pigs. We had no idea the impact of technology on children's brains. But it's not just that, but kids aren't moving anymore. Right? And physical movement, we know, is a huge coping skill. So that it's like goes hand in hand, right? The more you're on your device, the less you're physically moving, which is important to our health. So we need to spend more physical time with each other, because being attached to our devices will lead to detachment over time. So, and detachment, you know, between people is what causes a lot of our mental health issues.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's very good thing that you touch more on that, like community connections, Joy. You know, for me, growing up in the Philippines, I've actually remember we don't have that, you know, cell phone or this social media before, but you know, we're just playing in the streets like patintero or whatever. Whatever we can, you know, go do whatever in the streets. But that was good. It is a physical and community connections. And I think you've mentioned a while ago that, you know, community is a coping strategy for us for everyday stresses. And maybe Axella could add more on that.
Yeah. So I don't know. Joy touched a lot on that, like the importance of community, how it's integral to our culture. I know that feeling isolated can be very dangerous. It can lead to spiraling, feeling like there is no one you can go to help you through your problems, that there's no one to listen, that you don't feel supported, that you feel alone. And it can lead to more suffering and make things harder when you're already going through a hard time. So there's a lot of power in community and connection. Being able to share your struggles with others, especially with those who might be going through the same thing or can empathize with your situation, is really important to give you that sense of support and empathy. I don't know. I think it might not always be easy, though, for people to immediately identify who their community is.
Mm.
For newcomers, I know that not everybody is fortunate enough to have a set system or a set support system that already exists before they move. So some of them, for example, my parents, my dad came here alone, and then he brought his parents, his siblings, and then my mom came. But when he was here by himself, it was really hard. And back then there weren't a lot of Filipinos in like the 80s as there are now. Like you turn your head and there's Filipino. But yeah, so not everybody is as fortunate of having extended family already there to receive you when you come to Canada. So I know another issue in our community is there's not always the harmony that we hope for. And I think that's another issue that we as a community need to work on, so that people feel more welcome. They know that there are people there to support them and can understand where they're coming from. So I don't know. I don't know what we need to do exactly, but I feel like that would be something very beneficial for people who don't have that formal network yet, and would make that transition period much easier when they are acclimating to life in Canada. So I don't know. I mean, your immediate family could be your community at first, and then hopefully you'll be able to find those connections in other places as well.
Yeah. So that's why as I've said, that's why we're here and we're talking this together. We have a conversation because we want the community to get involved, right? So yeah, so we are all in this together. You have a lot of questions right now. Axella mentioned that she doesn't know, or I may not know, but together we can answer. Maybe we'll have an answer in the future. Yeah, I think April has a question.
My last question is, like, I guess you touched on this a little bit, Axella, and Joy, but how and why should we support, how can we support each other's mental well-being, like, as a Filipino community, and why should we do that? I mean, I guess that's obvious. I mean, we all are struggling. I think even myself growing up, like, having to identify with both Filipino and Canadian, it was, difficult. And it was always like, you need to speak Tagalog, and I didn't know why, and I fought it all the time, and I think, Axella, when we had the interview and we talked, it is like a very emotional journey, because we want to identify with our friends, and we, Canadians and everything. And I remember even then being in school, I barely had any Filipino classmates, and now, like, there's there's a huge population. And so how and how can we support the Filipino community and their mental well-being? I mean, is there anything you can add, Joy or Axella?
I think it makes sense for us to be the people at the table having the conversations with each other, because we understand each other's cultural context. We understand the patterns of the common struggles that most of us or many of us face, whether it be like parents who have moved to Canada relating with each other's experience, or youth who are struggling to navigate identity between Canadian culture and Filipino culture. There's a lot of commonalities that we experience, and I think it's just a lost opportunity if we don't realize that we have a lot of the same problems, and that that there is somebody with a listening ear who can empathize with you and make you feel like, oh, well, I'm not being maarte, or like I'm not, like, these problems aren't just out of nowhere, and it's not an issue, like, as you mentioned earlier, April, like, this isn't an individual issue. It's something at the community level that can be addressed. And there's a number of things that we need to look at, but we need everybody to be engaged in this conversation in order to raise awareness of the prevalence of these issues, and then start working together in eradicating them. So I don't know, I think when we want to think about destigmatizing having difficult conversations, mental health included, it opens a window to have more of the difficult conversations. And I think that's just the first part of creating change and acknowledging that the issues exist, not ignoring that they aren't hurting us and that they don't exist just for the individual, but for us at a community level as well.
Yeah, it's just really, adding just more to what you guys have already shared. Like, I think, you really touched on the struggle, right? Like both you and AC were sharing about the struggle. Like we all know the struggle, so let's not pretend that it doesn't exist, right? And so we are the only ones responsible for lifting each other up, because if we don't lift each other up, who's going to do it? But the other piece of that is we need to help each other, especially newcomers, without arrogance, right? Without a know-it-all attitude. The last thing I find that is helpful for anybody is a permanent resident or Canadian citizen being here for 5 years, and then, a newcomer asking a question and making that person feel stupid for asking that question, right? Let's all not, let's all not pretend that we also asked those same questions when we first came here, right? So we need to do it without competition, without feeling like we need to one-up each other. There's no sense in that. That's one of the things that we need as people, like as a Filipino community. And I know it's not intention. None of this is ill-intended, right? Like this is also, we also need to identify that a lot of the competitive natures Filipinos have, maybe a lot of the arrogance that has come up, from being here, is really a symptom of intergenerational trauma. It is really a symptom of the colonized ways that we were. We need to also identify with our Indigenous brothers and sisters that we too are a colonized people, right? And the reason why we get really competitive with each other, and we probably know this about maybe our elders, right? We've seen this happen. And it was never malice. There was no malice intent, but it's because that's our survival brain happening, right? That's how we've survived. That's how we've become resilient, is to have this like really, sometimes we're mayabang, right? It's this attitude that it's gotten us really far. But we also need to realize that it comes with really, detrimental consequences for our fellow people. But we also just have to be okay saying, we too were, overtaken for many, many years, and that has impacted our generation. So we are, as the ones that are coming up now, responsible for making sure that we don't do that to each other, right? We need to come together as a people and identify that, a lot of these things that we've seen are all symptoms of trauma being passed on from generation to generation. And that's okay, right? But we just need to acknowledge it.
All right, that was so awesome, Joy. And it's good that you touch more on the traits of our being a Filipino and being a colonized as part of our culture. So we will touch more actually on that in our upcoming series, and I hope we could still invite you for that. Still have the time to talk more and to tackle more on that. And as I remember, you touched more a lot of our what the Filipino community should do in order to support the families and especially the youth and their kids, right? And maybe we could share about more what are the community supports available in Edmonton, because I remember when I came here in 2015, I have only my wife here, and we don't have parents, just only my wife. She's been here for I think 9 or 10 years already. But when I came here, I want to be connected with our our community, and I can't find any Filipino organizations at that time because she didn't even know. Right? She's been here 10 years, but she's been working, right? So well, for myself, I just reached out to any organizations right there. I went to Catholic social services or immigrant serving organizations. But that was really important that we have also our Filipino community that supports us. And I have my support though. We have a lot of Filipinos in the church, so that was my first connection with our Filipino community here. But touching more on those on the other community supports, do you have anything or any community support or other than the Filipino community, other supports from the community, especially with mental health and well-being?
So we've really talked a lot up to this point about what we would identify as informal supports, right? So what you're asking, Nicole, is for formal support. So where I work, the agency is the Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op, and I for one speak Tagalog, so I provide counseling services in Tagalog, but we also have tons of groups there for different communities. We have specific parenting groups that are specifically for Filipinos, for instance, but they also do lots of work for helping with system navigation. So with helping, connect people to the formal system. So if it's, about like employment, like insurance, or if it's trying to get groups about education, whatever it is, there's quite a bit of stuff going on there. The Edmonton Mennonite Center for Newcomers is another big one. So that is another immigrant serving agency. And then you have like the regular ones that I hope people like start to look at, right? Like Big Brothers and Big Sisters Club. There's a new one that I've just come across. It's called Kids on Track. They offer a lot of free activities and programming for young people. The YWCA, YMCA, like there's lots of really good programming actually happening in Edmonton. If you Google something like Youth Support Edmonton, you'll find a number of organizations like serving youth in the community and their families, right? So there's lots out there.
All right, thank you so much, Joy. So maybe April, do you have anything to add?
I think we touched on a lot of really great points and how we can really start to be people who go out there and try to make a difference. Because I mean, we're having these conversations and we're going to launch it out, but we don't know who's going to watch it. But what's really amazing to me, especially sitting here seeing you, Axella, Joy, Nicole, and then going out into Hoy and Philsa and Philippine arts. We spoke about this, Axella. We didn't know these things even existed, and now I feel like we're finally awakening a generation that cares finally about shedding light on mental health. Like I know, especially with a lot of our members at Hoy, they're young adults, and it amazes me all the time when they come to me and they're not afraid anymore to shed light on what we need to do to become more, I guess, awakened in terms of who are we as a people and how do we feel about that, and be more prideful, but also know that, with coming here and being from two different cultures and trying to fit in, that we do come with some trauma that we need to deal with, which is amazing to me. But so I think that it's so great. And so thank you so much, you guys, for Joy and Axella, for taking the time and sharing your experience and expertise on this matter. And I know it won't be the last time that you'll be sharing it. And this is only the beginning of open conversations about mental health within the Filipino community. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Axella and Joy. Yeah, you were awesome. You learned a lot, actually. So that was indeed an awesome conversation. And, I've learned a lot, especially in the area of mental health and self-care, and of course in our community, right? So how about you, April? What's with you? what are the learnings or the key takeaways from that?
Well, I think for me, and I think Joy touched on it, it's, she did mention, being a new mom, being in this pandemic. Mental health has become like at the forefront of my life currently, because it has been challenging, and you don't get to see your family in the same way, but acknowledging that, knowing that that's okay, and knowing that I need to take care of myself and not feel guilty about that, and giving myself permission for that, I think has become something that's helped me immensely in navigating through being, a parent of a newborn, and being in this pandemic, and also dealing with, from the Filipino background, like not being normal, like not normalized in terms of, oh, okay lang yan, like at least my anak ka and healthy, whatever. And I'm happy, I'm grateful, but also knowing that it's okay sometimes to not feel okay, and to accept that and move on after I've felt those emotions, which is really interesting. And I think that knowing that we're talking about this and having open conversations, that's so beneficial and that's so eye-opening for all of us. So
that's great. And actually, as we are having this conversation, and specifically for the youth, but I just popped in my mind that it might be the parents should also know about these things, because our youth might be open, but how about the parents? So they have to understand this one, and they have, as our the title of our conversation is UNAWA, and both of the parents should understand the situation, and we are, for myself, I'm a parent right now, so I should have better understanding what's happening, right? So so actually, we're about to end, and I guess we're talking a lot, of course, of community supports, and especially the Filipino community, April, and this is our hope, actually, that we will we will talk more about the community supports and what's the importance of the community helping one another, and talking about community. So we will dig deeper into our Filipino culture, actually, in our next episode, and that's to help us understand what shaped us. I think Axella and Joy has made a good point of giving us some sort of a background, that are being a colonized clan, or a Filipino community, has given us the stigma and the significance of our heritage. So we'll talk more about that, and also our heritage could maybe could help us eliminate this stigma, right? So that will be our topic for our next session.
Great, and I'll also be joined by Ida Lucila from the Philippine Arts Council, and the Centes, community organizer, and they'll help us discover the beauty of culture and heritage, and how these can be a great tool in addressing our mental health issues and well-being, especially among the youth.
Yeah, this is awesome. So stay tuned in our next episode, guys, and we'll journey together as one community. That's what April said. It's not just a one-person battle, but it is a community that will strive to know more, and we will really journey as one together. And once again, I'm Cools, and I hope to see you then.
Yes, absolutely. And again, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. This is April, and we'll see you in our next conversation. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thank you.